Goodluck Jonathan, who is the person inviting us to this great event, the governor of Bauchi State. May I say that I align with all the protocols already established. Or as we say in East Africa, I would like to say, all protocols observed. Let me begin by noting that it's a great honor to give this keynote address at the 2026 Goodluck Jonathan Foundation Democracy Dialogue, and I would like to thank His Excellency, the President, for this particular invitation. I am saying that this is an important dialogue that we should be having in Africa for several reasons. Some of them have already been identified here. But one of the main reasons that we should be bearing in mind is that this is a space that Goodluck Jonathan Foundation is providing us in Africa to discuss the Africa of today and the Africa that future generations will enjoy and live in. We want an Africa where Japa, or what I hear in Nigeria, the youth say Japa, moving and flying out of the country because there are no jobs across Africa. So we want a continent where there will be no Japa unless you are going out for tourism. But let's say, and honestly, that the youth who go out of Africa for jobs are voting with their feet because our policies have failed them. We cannot provide security for them. We cannot provide jobs for them. And the education that we offer them does not give them any particular opportunities. And that's why I would really like to commend the foundation for this very important occasion. But let me also add here that the future of this continent, as recognized by Goodluck Jonathan's foundation, lies in our very hands. But the future will depend on how we conduct our elections and build our political parties. Although former President Obasanjo seems to say that actually we need to recraft and to rethink our political parties. I will also be coming back to that very shortly. To think about Africa of the future, we need not only think about elections and political parties or even the role of the judiciary, but we also need to think about policies that work for our people. We have elections almost every other 4 years here in Nigeria, Ghana, for every 5 years in Kenya, every 5 years in Uganda, Tanzania, and many other countries in Africa. Periodic elections from 1960s when the continent was decolonized. But it is a pity that even if we have had elections for those many years, we have not eradicated poverty on the continent. We are indicted. Today, close to 120 million here in Nigeria are poor. That's close to 50%, 46% of the population. Another number, 44% in Kenya are poor. In Tanzania, the same. 60% of the blacks in South Africa who are chasing everyone out of the continent, the blacks in South Africa are poor in spite of democracy. So we need to rethink our elections and the role of even political parties so that it's not only politics that we should be concerned about, but governance that can feed our people. We need political parties that think beyond political competition and think about how to prevent the youth from getting frustrated. May I emphasize again that this space that is being created here for us to discuss the Africa we want is special and of a very different kind across Africa. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself, when did the African Union have a gathering of this nature discussing Africa's present and future? Or think even about ECOWAS, SADC, or East African Community. They discuss what leaders would like to hear. I'm very happy that the tone has been set of very candid discussions. And it's my hope that the foundation will continue with this particular sky the limit kind of discussions where there is no censorship as we have in other organs within the continent. But this dialogue is also important in another kind. We are having this discussion in Nigeria. And Nigeria is not any other country in Africa. Nigeria is a pace setter in many respects. It's not only one of the largest economies, but it is the home of the most successful entrepreneurs on the continent. It's the home of Africa's billionaires. It's the home of major cultural identities. And a country that seeks to foster peace everywhere in the world, everywhere in Africa. In my own country, President Obasanjo has been there many times. And every time he comes there, he's celebrated more than we celebrate our own. But Nigeria also represents contradictions we see in Africa. Represents the contradictions we see in Africa because that vibrancy has got paradoxes also, in the sense that political parties and the successive governments have not really been able to address the question of development challenges that face most of Nigeria's future, Nigerians' children. And I'm saying that simply because this is the trend everywhere in the world. This is the trend everywhere in Africa. That our governments have not been able to address the key challenges that confront. Let me digress and say, Your Excellency, there's something very unique about Nigerians, and I want to be very honest, Your Excellency. Nigerians are the most patriotic individuals we have on the continent. When I was in Europe studying for my PhD, we used to have many friends, Nigerians, Ghanaians, Zimbabweans. And every time, because it was in the 90s, we would all talk very badly about our own respective countries. But if you dare speak bad about Nigeria, you risked losing your teeth. Nigerians, and I think I learned this from last night, your national anthem actually bestows a sense of patriotism. So no matter how Nigerians see the country looking like, they don't discuss it in that negative manner like other countries do. And I'm saying that's very exceptional. That's very exceptional, and I must admit that's very exceptional. And I think Nigerians need to celebrate themselves for that. But can we tap that? Can we embrace that collectiveness to prevent Japan? Can we embrace that collectiveness to have a spirit of addressing the key challenges that hold Nigeria and that hold the continent from becoming a better continent for all? Let me go back to the question of elections again and point out that the question itself that has been posed and we have been addressing has been addressed by the key speakers is very important in its own right. But there is no starting point other than trying to recall the ones of the late Professor Claude Ake, a Nigerian son, who in the 1990s said, democracy appears to be triumphant and unassailable. Unfortunately to him, the triumph of democracy is more apparent than real. Democracy and elections are no longer threatening political elites around the world or even in Africa because they can enjoy democracy without getting bothered about its outcome. In other words, Today in Africa, even across the world actually, no one fears democracy anymore. In the past, we had leaders who did not want to hold elections or to hear the word democracy. But today, no one fears to hold elections, for instance. Some leaders are not afraid of holding elections because how can you lose an election that you are organizing? Unless you have a good justice, as I have had seated here, right? How can you lose an election when you are the incumbent and you have got state resources? How can you lose an election when you can buy a judge rather than hire a lawyer or an advocate? How can you lose an election when you can decide who to vote, who is going to vote? And that's the word that our late Tadika Mukandawera would always think about, that in Africa actually leaders can choose voters. You can decide who is in the voter register. You can decide how to disenfranchise voters. You can decide to cause violence during the polling day, and by having violence, women will be the first people to disappear from the polling station, and they won't come back. And that's why some leaders don't fear to hold elections. But the other negative trends and the negative phenomena that is taking place in the world today, extremist governments are on the rise even in Europe, voted by their own people. America is very different from the America we knew. United Kingdom is different from the country we knew. The Scandinavians, some of them are different from what we knew. There are democratic reversals across the world today, not in Africa alone. But what's more, coups have returned in Africa, military interventions have returned, and getting support of the citizens because elections have become less meaningful to many people. Elections have become less meaningful because they do not tend to respond to the needs of the ordinary people. Once elected, leaders disappear. They don't get back to their constituencies. They don't get to bother about what people are talking about. And because they don't care about what people care about, in the next election, they come with goodies. They line them up. And this is a phenomenon that is very common in Ghana, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, name it. And once they do that, elections then cause disillusionment among the citizens. They cause disillusionment and people start wondering whether actually we are independent or not. So people want meaningful choices across the continent, but we are not giving them that meaningful elections. They want choices, but we are preventing them from having those particular choices. And I must admit, many members of parliament disappear from constituencies because they know they can buy people. And probably this is why we keep our people poor. Because you can have goodies and give them the much you can and they will vote for you. But unfortunately, it's people who queue for goodies these days. So in other words, I'm simply saying that we need to start rethinking even how we conduct our elections. But it's not elections alone that we should be thinking about. Democracy does not have any other option than the option of respecting people's will. Democracy does not have any other option because it is based on the need and the ability to compete freely in a society. It is based on the understanding that rules that apply to everyone will apply to everyone equally. And that's where the courts matter. I must commend the Justice, Madam Justice here, for what I've heard so far. And therefore I will reserve the comments that I wanted to make about judiciary for that reason. But nonetheless, I'll speak about judiciary in other parts of the continent. But we must be worried because we are not giving our voters the choices they desire. Sometimes we manipulate rules in order to fit ourselves and our interests, forgetting that people matter. And it's only recently, as recent as 5 or 6 years ago, that the courts in some parts of the continent have stamped their authority on telling leaders there is an extent to which you can rig elections, but the will of the people must be respected. And therefore, they overturned elections in Kenya. The courts overturned elections in Malawi. In other countries, the judges are cowed, intimidated, or they are disappeared. And that, of course, causes fear almost everywhere. But if you look across the continent, the trend is really disturbing. The trend is very disturbing because judges are captured, pocketed, and sometimes, as I argue later, become part of the executive in many respects. This has resulted to citizens lacking trust in our institutions. This has resulted in citizens losing faith in our government. And this has resulted in citizens losing trust in political parties. But there is more reason why people are losing trust in political parties. It's because political parties across the continent are not living to their expectations. Political parties across the continent do not have policies to transform the society. They have policies to outcompete one another. They have policies to outcompete one another, but not policies to transform the continent, not policies to transform their respective countries. And in fact, even succession, leadership succession in some political parties leaves a lot to be desired. And that's why we say when political parties fail, the contest then becomes that of personalities and the other social dimensions like identities, like ethnicity itself, tribes, or even political parties become captured by dominant interests in the society. And when you look at political parties, whether Nigeria or everywhere across Africa, one thing becomes very clear. What we have today is not the traditional political parties of the 60s that made a lot of difference on the continent. In fact, political parties to political leaders today are like Danfo, Keke, or Okanda. And I believe these are public transport vehicles. Yeah, political parties are like Okada or Danfo to take you from one election to another. And because they are not very well serviced, they break along the way. And when they break along the way, we have a lot of factions. I don't know how many factions we have in this room of different political parties. I believe we have many factions. It's a common thread across the continent. One party can have 3 or 4 factions. And you are lucky if you belong, if you are supporting the government of the day. If you are supporting the government of the day, the ruling party, you can be allowed to be a member of many parties and no law will catch up with you. No law will catch up with you because you'll be protected. That fraud is protected by the ruling elites. And that's a pity because we are not then building institutions of democracy. We are making political parties themselves laughable on the continent. But let me also point out that when I'm talking about political parties, I'm not talking about ruling political parties alone. I am tempted to argue that even opposition political parties today across the continent are the mirror image of the government they criticize. They are waiting to get into the government, but we have never seen the difference in how they govern. I'm tempted to argue that even opposition political parties, when they get into office, they don't have the capacity to begin their administration. I'm tempted to argue that the difference between opposition political parties and the government is that they are all political parties. They behave the same. Otherwise, we would have been seeing changes on the continent. And there are some countries, actually, when political parties win elections and others are in the opposition. Those in the opposition, the first thing they do is to knock on the door of the government asking, can we come in? Can we have an alliance? And that itself minimizes the importance of political parties in many ways. Let me also end this point by saying that even political parties themselves lack internal democracy. And yet we want them to have internal democracy in order to govern successfully. They rig their own party elections. They nominate the candidates they want. They don't give voice to ordinary citizens. And they relate with ordinary citizens as, and by the way, you know who you will give a ticket in the next general election, whether people want it or not. This is the tragedy of our political parties. But there is another phenomenon that is worrying. Elections on the continent have become very expensive in a manner that prevents women and the youth and physically and those who are able differently from participating in elections. I've been looking at the studies on cost of politics in Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and a couple of other countries, and I'm surprised that House of Representatives requires not less than 500 million naira. In Kenya, $300,000. And to become a governor, I think you require something close to 2 billion naira. And it becomes very difficult for women to mobilize such amount of money. So in the process, you mobilize that kind of resources by using private businesses. And the moment you use private businesses, and I'm not talking about even presidential candidate Obi, I'm not talking about presidential. You mobilize private businesses to give you support. And the moment you win an election, they capture your policies. So you are back to zero again, because the policies they capture are not for the interest of the society, but for the interest of their own. In addition to lacking democracy, political parties seem not to be having an agenda that can be differentiated from one another. Ideology, the dogmatic differences, ideological differences in terms of policies that used to differentiate political parties in the past is no longer in place. So one cannot tell what one particular party belongs to and what it doesn't. But even if this is the situation, at least we can say when there is fair competition, then judiciary can come in and arbitrate disputes with ease. But the only problem with the judiciary and the courts in particular is that the courts across the continent have become commodified. And where from my part of the world we say, why would you like to hire a lawyer when you can buy a judge? Why would you like to waste your money by hiring an advocate and yet you can buy a judge? That means a lot. It means that access to justice is only possible for those who have got money and those who have got political power. And that itself has ruined the independence of the judiciary across the continent, or in many parts of the continent. The courts cannot uphold the rule of law, neither can they arbitrate disputes in a fair manner or in a manner that can be seen to be fair by everyone in the society. But this is even worse. It's even worse where we have got strong executives or strong presidentialism. It is even worse where parliament is co-opted and where parliament is weakened. Because in the process of weakening Parliament, you also seek to weaken the judiciary. And when the ruling party is dominant and the opposition are knocking on the door of the government to be part of the government, you lose everything. But we must also admit that as political parties, we put the judges under tremendous pressure. When judges are given disputes from among the politicians and those disputes are taken to the court, we must admit that we turn the judiciary into another political battlefield. We must admit we are asking judiciary to arbitrate disputes that we have been unable to resolve politically. And therefore, the rules us in such a manner will always castigate the judiciary negatively, irrespective of the reasons that the judges have made. So turning the judiciary into a new battlefield is something we need to start sympathizing with and ask ourselves, is there a way we can arbitrate our disputes, political disputes, without taking them to the judges? Because in the process of doing so, we politicize the judiciary. In fact, we have instances where presidents on this continent have warned the courts because of the manner in which they have determined presidential cases or even parliamentary cases. So you end up having courts and the judges having a lot of fear in how to address political cases and political disputes because you don't know whether you'll be alive or not. And if they are not intimidated, for sure, they are co-opted. Some are bribed with houses. Some are bribed with cars. Or even cash is a common phenomenon. And this is why we need to start thinking very carefully about what is it that can be done in the society to protect our courts, our judges, from intimidation by politicians and make them as independent as they should be. And there are several ways to think about. One is to depoliticize political cases that go to courts, and of course, embolden the judges and the courts in order to stand their ground because what they are giving as evidence for how they determine the cases is proper and well thought about.